worse? How could it be worse? Jehovah, Jehovah, Jehovah! I'm warning you, if you say Jehovah once more, right? Was it you? Yes. Right, well, you did say Jehovah.
Shalom. Welcome, Bruchim Abiyim. I'm Rabbi Paul, your virtual rabbi. You have found Beit Virtuali, and let's stir up a little Torah together. And first of all, before I get stones thrown at me, I chose that clip because A, life of Brian. Do I need another reason? If so, and if some who are deeply concerned about hearing the name of God, or at least what they think the name of God is spoken aloud, are feeling those feelings, it's good to add a few kernels of information on top of the hilarity of Python Crew's holding of a mirror to institutionalized religion's occasional hypocrisy. Let's just say that the name of the Eternal is a proper name, like we understand proper names, a sort of divine Chris or Pat. It's not, but let's just say. And then let's just say that Lo tisat Shem Adonai Elohecha lashav actually should be translated as "Thou shalt not take the name of the Lord thy God in vain." I mean, it shouldn't, but let's just say. And then finally, let's just say that one of the laws that follow from this poorly translated utterance is actually that it's forbidden to speak the holy Chris or Pat as if the Eternal was human and named as a human is named. Even if we say all this, there was no J sound in biblical Hebrew. The linguistic and multiple language movement from the four-letter ineffable name of the totality of all that binds us and all in the universe together rendered over time those four letters into a sort of divine Chris or Pat. The Torah itself makes a clear case that Chris or Pat was not the goal. "What's your name?" asks Moses. "I am that I am." That's not a name. Even though we have constantly misunderstood this call to radical interconnectivity and non-anthropomorphism and reacted essentially with, "Well, nice to meet you, I am that I am. Can't wait to take you home and introduce you to my folks." Jehovah is not the name of God presented in the Hebrew Bible. It is an inauthentic pronunciation of a Latinized attempt to render the Greek misunderstood rendering of the Hebrew into a divine Chris or Pat. So,
Jehovah, Jehovah, Jehovah!
no lightning. No stones. Still, there is tradition and there is law. We don't try and pronounce the ineffable name and instead use replacements or ersatz names in prayer and public reading. Of course, this as well brings up levels of, well, let's just call it complexity, as the most common ersatz name used is Adonai, which means Lord and is not the divine name.
כשאתה אומר לא תישא את שם אדוני לשווא, אז לא הרגע אמרת את השם שלו?
לא, אדוני זה לא השם שלו.
אז איך קוראים לו?
קוראים לו אדוני.
אז כן קוראים לו אדוני.
לא, זה לא השם שלו אדוני. השם שלו מתחיל בי' ונגמר ב-A. יוספה. לא, נו.
יודה.
עזבו, לא חשוב. שאלה הבאה.
Clearly, some of our tribe get the underlying complexity, if not hilarity. One could say Adonai is a divine name, however, among many, and indeed has become so sacred in its own right that many then choose to say Hashem, literally meaning the name, as an ersatz for Adonai. And yes, there are replacements and variant spellings as well for Hashem, as that for some feels like it has in its own way become too elevated to use in everyday speech. I will link below to videos where I've already talked quite a bit about all that. The most common misunderstanding is that we've forgotten how to say the divine name, as that was a secret entrusted to the Kohen Gadol, or the high priest in temple times, and as there's not been for 2,000 years either a temple or a high priest, we tell each other the secret has been lost. Of course, for that to be true, the divine name would still have to be a type of divine Chris or Pat. The best contemporary explanation I have heard in everyday language, or I've read in everyday language, comes from our old friend and oft quoted on this channel, Rabbi Lawrence Kushner, and his "God was in this place and I did not know it." Once inside the Holy of Holies on Yom Kippur, the high priest had to do only one thing. He would utter the Shem HaMefrash, the ineffable four-letter name of God. Yud, He, Vav, He. It's a name made from the three letters of the Hebrew alphabet that function primarily as vowels. How do you pronounce all the vowel sounds at once? The reason that God's name is unpronounceable is because the name of being is the sound of breathing. The high priest went into the innermost sanctuary and simply breathed. Rabbi Kushner does what we honestly all should be doing, working hard to remove ourselves from associating name of God with our everyday use of names. the more we conflate the non-everyday four-letter divine name with Chris and Pat, and I'm truly sorry to every wonderful Chris and Pat that listens to this. You are great sports. The more we are likely to consider God as something with human attributes. It takes work, constant work, to step out of this place. And still, we do need to consider our Halacha, or the Jewish law that has come to us, as most Jews don't go around crying out linguistically and theologically false renderings of the Hebrew, unless of course they are quoting Monty Python, as one is wont to do. The most common concern we have regards the blotting out or the erasing of the divine name. The most concise version of this Halacha comes from Maimonides' Mishnah Torah, from Yesodei Torah, or the Foundations of Torah, at the beginning of chapter 6. Whoever destroys one of the holy and pure names with which the Holy Blessed One of Being is called is liable for lashes, as is required in Torah. I'll go ahead and link below to the full passage so you can see which 7 names will get you lashed. We most certainly wouldn't want that. This specifically goes back to Talmud, a discussion in Tractate Shavuot, which itself is derived from Torah and the whole name in vain thing, whatever it is that means. The result today is choices in the divine English language, such as writing G-D instead of G-O-D, which again is dealt with in some of the videos below. Doing this, the dash spelling of God, comes from several places, usually on the continuum from repeating what others have done without knowing the reasons why, to building a fence around the Torah, which is shorthand for going a little further in the observance of a mitzvah to make darn sure that no sinning occurs. I'm not even mocking anything here, as in certain contexts, I do the same thing. Most specifically when I'm teaching in an Orthodox community, in which case, unless the teaching is specifically on this point of law, I will follow local custom or minhag for the sake of the community, which is also the high mitzvah of being concerned with hospitality, hachnasat orchim. The greater point here is that this choice is neither wrong nor right, but like all things Jewish, we should probably read and learn and discuss and challenge ourselves before we judge others for their actions, meaning that they did it a way that we don't. Even the great and most definitely Orthodox Rabbi Joseph P. Soloveitchik famously walked into a classroom at yeshiva, wrote G-O-D on the blackboard, and then erased it to make a point. There are multiple opinions, point made, and soapbox. But all this does make a tiny detail in Parashat Nasso quite interesting. Whenever our yearly cycle reaches Nasso, I tend to personally struggle a little. The first part of the Parsha concerns itself with the duties of the various Levitical sub-tribes, the Gershonites, and is usually the source of my drashot. The next part concerns itself with the laws of Sota, which is an ancient ritual meant to deal with an adulterous woman. This is always humbling for me, as most of my rabbinate is predicated on either finding underlying symbols rather than looking at the literal, or taking something whose context is radically different time and transporting it into today to find meaning. Sota is one of the places where I struggle, as the process is so appalling that I even struggle getting past the literal words. A tiny detail comes from the section of the Sota process where a sort of magic potion is made with bitter water in order to close out the distasteful process that we have just slogged through and lead to a potential of marital reconciliation. One of the ingredients for this magic potion is fascinating and quite surprising and perhaps a little bit confusing. The priest is to call out a curse, which starts with the charming words, "May the Eternal make you a curse and imprecation among your people." Some details follow that you can find for yourself, and then the priest shall put these curses down into writing and rub it off into the water of bitterness. Now, I make the case over and over that we read the words of Torah, but we don't actually see or process the words of Torah. This has my entire life also been the case with this verse until encountering a passage from the Talmud at nearly the end of Tractate Chulin, which mostly interests itself with dietary laws. On Daf, or page 141a, we end up in a discussion on the hierarchy of positive mitzvot, the idea that there are some things that we are required to do, a positive mitzvah, as opposed to a negative mitzvah, something we should not do, that take precedence over others. That there is a hierarchy here, that some are more important than others should be obvious. But, for example, when I see people acting hatefully against others that have a different Shabbat practice, deeply religious and ostensibly learned people seem to have forgotten that loving one's neighbor as oneself stands far above not driving on Shabbat. The example that's used in the Talmud, however, is our verse from Nasso, and the obvious explanation is still shocking if we've never thought of it before. What is the strength of that other positive mitzvah over this positive mitzvah? You might call to mind when Yudah Hanasi said, "Great is the peace between a man and his wife," as the Torah said that the name of the Holy Blessed One of Being, which is written in sanctity, shall be erased on the waters. In other words, as distasteful as the Sota ritual might be to us, the purpose of the last part of the ritual is to reestablish peace in a household where the peace has been lost. To do this, even the name of the divine, which has been written down for the ritual, should be blotted out. And I've not heard about these priests getting lashes for their apparent disregard of Jewish law. So, what's up here? On the surface, the lesson is clear and powerful. Having peace and a functioning family is more important in Jewish law going way back to its origins than was even the unblemished sanctity of the divine name in writing. Misguided, yet unfortunately nearly universal thoughts outside of Judaism seeing Jewish texts as describing only a vengeful God don't really jive with this. A religion with a cartoonish petty deity, as so many wish to portray, would never allow their name to be taken in vain for any reason, like the king that does not allow you to turn your back on them as you leave the throne room. The priority of a tyrant is the inevitable narcissism of the tyrant. The actual content of Jewish sacred texts says that peace in a family is more important than a literal following of ritual law. The ritual is important, but your relationships come first. What a message. And if this message is surprising, then perhaps we need to do a little rethinking of our own presuppositions. The next level of interpretation falls a little more into the mystical, so take a deep breath. If this falls out of your comfort zone, I promise I'll make it quick, at least quick for me. It's not just that the name of the Eternal is blotted out. It's washed into the bitter water potion and becomes a part of that which is then ingested. At a symbolic level, this is breathtaking. A partnership relationship has been broken and needs to be repaired. Part of the healing is internalizing the divine name. Perhaps this can be understood once again by thinking of those deeply religious people that throw stones at others on Shabbat, because the deeply religious people think that those that they are throwing the stones at are polluting the Sabbath. The television captures the two groups. One, perhaps in a car, not dressed in 16th century Polish clothing. The other, dressed in 16th century Polish clothing, throwing rocks at the first group. Which group appears to have less internalized the central messages of Torah? I'm going to go ahead and say the group throwing the rocks. Call me old-fashioned. In this interplay, even if all involved are members of the same tribe, the relationship has been broken. The only fix is for those that have done the greatest breaking is to re-internalize, to swallow the central message of Torah. The radical interconnectivity implicit and embodied in the divine name as expressed in such verses as, love your neighbor as yourself. Yes, admitted, perhaps the family in the car would benefit from a deeper relationship with their ritual tradition, especially if their driving is an attempt to deliberately provoke. They may not be blameless, but their act of not throwing rocks means that the internalization of Torah that they need is a little less radical than the rock throwers. Which brings us finally to the last interpretation and accompanying iterative question. Relationships are hard. Maintaining them past the initial several month to a year extreme chemical high means working through the human universal propensity to harm humans, including, or perhaps especially, those closest to us. The work of mending the inevitable pain can, for many, just be greater than the work required to end even a marriage relationship. There's no judgment here, just the fact of how relationships form and dissolve. Add to this infidelity, something that, depending on which statistics we cite, will affect about 1 in 5 or 1 in 4 marriages for my Anglophone readers and listeners, and we have a mess. Here's something interesting when you research Sota. There's not a whole lot of evidence that it ever took place. Was the writing of it supposed to be a deterrent, or something more like someone's ideal solution that got kept in because of its existence in older authoritative texts, even though it was not ever a practical part of the everyday? There are indeed other examples of this, such as the Jubilee year. Still, in a series of texts that went through multiple periods of redaction, Sota is glaring in its cruelty. Is there any other possible reason that this text could have been kept that doesn't assume the very worst of our ancestors? From the perspective of a pastoral therapist, there's a hard truth for marriages that work through infidelity and move on, keeping the marriage intact. When one partner looks at the other, they will often see that partner stamped forever with a type of scarlet A. Their very existence now contains this attribute as if it has been fused into their being. Now, I recognize what I'm about to say is risky and difficult. Without in any way justifying infidelity, there are many ways to hurt a partner. We can make the case that infidelity is the worst, but most of us can actually pretty quickly think of horrors that make that statement a lie. The most bitter truth to swallow is that over the course of time, two humans that know each other well can find all sorts of ways to be awful to another. From a symbolic perspective, where I use my imagination instead of ever wishing for such a ritual like Sota, let's say there's a partner that has been cheated on by the other, and the cheating partner has to go through the entire horrific ritual, while the cheated upon partner is forced to watch. Only a sociopathic or pathologically narcissistic partner would watch the travail and not be forced to look at themselves at some point in all the hurt that they caused the other, but they're not suffering for. If we're scorekeepers and see infidelity as the absolute worst thing, then our lifetime of belittling the other, threatening the other, locking the other away from a life of potential and possibility, controlling, lying, and manipulating can be thrust into the breast pocket of forgetfulness as we revel in the justification of, well, at least I never did that. But we have done at least some, if not all, of the others. And quite frankly, as humans with complicated emotions, if we've been in a relationship long enough, we've probably at some level even given an emotional, if not physical, part of ourselves to another that we would not accept were the situation reversed and the giver our partner. If it's not literal, if it never actually happened, then Sota could perhaps be the shock of the mirror where I admit that relationships have two parties, and we give as good as we get. Is it possible that Sota conceptually works because it takes such a shock to get us to look in the mirror? Is it that only when we see our guilty partner's extreme suffering are we able to ask, even in the smallest way, the part that we played in the pain we ourselves have caused? Put slightly differently, if we have finally internalized that the divine name is not a name, but is a variation of the Hebrew verb to be, its existence, then what is the true meaning of this blotting out of the divine name in this context? Well, if the full existence, the to be of my partner has become how they have wronged me, the relationship will only be whole after, yes, they've made sincere teshuvah, but as well when I've looked in the mirror. This is key, as nothing that I'm saying makes any sense if there isn't an attempt to make teshuvah, to recognize that the harm has been done, ask forgiveness, and work to repair the harm. But if that exists, then we have an after which is greatest peace. For a little of existence itself is swallowed for the sake of peace. That's what it takes. Without saying that anyone is forced to do anything, without judging if someone chooses to say, nope, I'm done. This is what it takes. If I'm choosing to look at the existence of my partner for the rest of their days through the lens of what may have been one horrible mistake, I have as well better be looking to hold my mistakes up to the same light. Our default mode is to rewire ourselves to see the worst, then post about it, hashtag it, make it a permanent part of our identity, our existence, our to be, our name of God. Perhaps that needs to be swallowed. As we each year approach Nasso, the question should arise as we are holding the greatest grudges against those that have harmed us, even those close to us, if we have used the opportunity, after we ourselves have engaged in teshuvah, to swallow a little of existence. The part of existence that allows us to see another a way we would never want to be seen. If I now see someone that has hurt me only as a person that hurt me, even after they have done work, and we have done work, then the burden of the one who hurts will slowly shift primarily to me. Shabbat Shalom. Thank you for being a part of Beit Virtuali. We'll see you next time.
Beit Yisrael, Beit Yisrael.